This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome into another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. I'm Bill Bartholomew. On this episode, a conversation with longtime broadcaster and the co-host of the Cat Country Morning Show, Brian Mulhern. Let's start in the present and we'll work our way backwards. What's it been like? You're on really one of the most listened to radio shows in the market. People wake up and get their bearings with you on a daily basis. What's that like? That's kind of my dream.
It's funny, and I don't know if this is going to sound like a steaming load of crap, but I try not to pay attention too much to things like numbers. When I was younger, I did much more so, but I find for my own mental health, because I've got a touch of the OCD, that it's better for me not to know. And believe you me, if those numbers aren't there, they will let me know.
Gotcha.
So I'm a big fan of just kind of keeping my head down, doing what I'm doing, putting on a show that I feel is relatable to both the audience and to myself. You know, you've got to be a fan of what you're doing to some degree as well. And that's basically how we approach it at Cat Country, both Maddie and myself, and Amanda before Maddie. And, you know, man, I've been doing this for going on 30 years. So I don't want to say I'm on autopilot, because it takes an awful lot of work to be able to sustain any career at this point for decades. So I do work very hard at what I do, but I try not to think about it too much.
No, that's a fascinating way of approaching it, you know, where it's almost a blessing in disguise. And it's something I mentioned this last night when I was doing a live stream, that Scott McKay at the Publix Radio, I asked him for advice like a year ago as I was building up Bartholomew Town. And that was one thing that he said, that he never checks numbers or number of downloads or anything like that. He just keeps moving. And it's hard, you know, but at the same time, who cares? If you're reaching people and you're getting a reaction, then that's what matters anyway, I guess, you know?
Not only from that perspective, Bill, being the old man now in radio, and boy, oh boy, did that go by fast. It's a whole new world out there. And I say this all the time. When I first started, there were 4 hours a day that people could tell me that I sucked. You know, they only had one option, which was to pick up the phone and let me know that way. And then along came the internet and email and faxes too. I don't want to not give that their due. And people could get you that way. But then once social media exploded, it just became this nonstop thing where people have access to you in 1,000 different directions. And I know that people have a hard time understanding this. I got into radio, and I also did television writing because I wanted to do something creative and yet somehow remain relatively anonymous. Had I saw everything that was coming, and the fact that right now, here I am on camera, Bartholomew Town, speaking with you and putting my face out there and putting myself out there, because it is, as you well know, a marketing tool. Social media is a necessary evil, but it's also dangerous. And in being that old man, I try to impress upon some of the younger people, read what people are saying about you to a certain degree. Don't read all of it. If you find that it's upsetting you, just get up and go throw a Frisbee around or something.
Yeah.
And don't respond to all of it. I think it is important to have a relationship with people who take the time to listen to you and thank them and acknowledge them for their time. But when it comes to the trolls and it comes to people who have nothing better to do than to try to ruin your life for sport, you got to take it for what it is, and you can't let it bother you. And I would say the same thing about ratings to a degree, unless it's putting your career in danger. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what do I need to do to stop the bleeding to get those numbers back up? And yeah, that's definitely a process, but that's also a team effort. That's not something that I do by myself. I have a program director, Bob Walker. I have my co-host, Madeline Grimaldi. We have an entire team that tries to figure all of that stuff out. So I try not to put the entire weight of the world on my shoulders. Life is hard enough than to intentionally add to any of that.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And there's already so much pressure. You know, whenever someone from Channel 10 comes on, or WPRO, or in your case, and look, Channel 12 is doing a good job of catching up, but they're Cat Country, I mean, you are a standard bearer, so you're not like this little engine that could, small time morning show. I think back to the showgram back in the day on Cat Country, and now it's a position in the market that is, no one's impressed by the fact that you're necessarily at the top anymore. You just have to maintain that. It's not really celebrated in the way that if you came out of nowhere and all of a sudden, boom, here you are in the thick of it. So it's a different angle.
Don't screw it up is essentially what it is. And you mentioned the showgram, and I do want to give a shout out to Tim Leary. I actually started on that show. My radio career was forced into a bit of a break, and I had to kind of start back down at the bottom again. And I was doing traffic for the likes of Buddy Cianci, Dan York, Matt Allen at times. And I was also doing a sports segment locally on EEI and the now defunct BRU. Mm-hmm. And people like Buddy and people like Tim Leary could have said to me at the time, just shut up and do the traffic. But they trusted me, and they gave me an opportunity to be a part of the content again and show what I could do. And if not for people like them, I'd probably be selling shoes now. No word of a lie. So I just wanted to acknowledge them, because all along the way, as I said about the Cat Country team, you don't do all of this by yourself. You do it with a team of people, and you need other people to believe in you. And I always try to keep that in mind when I see somebody who's coming up. I try to treat the intern the same way that I would treat the president of the company, remembering that I was once that intern, and also knowing full well that I will never be the president of the company. But still, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have the same goal.
Absolutely. All right, let's go back in time. Obviously, you mentioned television writing. You worked with Phil Hartman, who that's a Mount Rushmore name, and really.
Thank you for that. And I completely and totally agree. And one of the things that breaks my heart to a degree about Phil Hartman, and breaks my heart to the degree that I am a very old man about to turn 50, is how quickly that time goes by, and how quickly the likes of a mammoth talent on his level can become forgotten. And it may shock you to know that on May 28th of 2020, he will have been dead for 22 years.
Wow.
And I can't even wrap my head around that number myself, because so much of it seems like it happened yesterday. But when I talk about people believing in me and helping me along, you want to talk about the Mount Rushmore, he is at the top of that list. And there is no better validation in life than to have somebody on the level of a Phil Hartman say, I think you're pretty good. I mean, that's really all you need. To this day, when I'm feeling like crap about myself, if I catch something from one of those social media trolls, I'm like, oh yeah, wait a minute. He's not Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman said I was worth
Yeah. No, that is, I can totally imagine what that would, it would be entering into your bloodstream permanently, and it's going to be with you for life. And then also part of your legacy 50, 100 years from now, when the book on, the radio book is written, the many volumes of it, and you get to, the M's and the letter M, and you're in there, that will be a part of your story. And, it's something that you can't ignore. You see a lot of people who, they exaggerate, whether it's their, speaking of numbers, numbers of the downloads or whatever it is, or the amount of people they're listening and so on and so forth. But there's no number, there's no metric around somebody who's a mammoth talent, as you say, bringing you into the tent. And once you're in, it does change you, I would imagine. And it kind of gives you a confidence, but also a perspective that, look, it can be done. Human beings are capable of this enormous amount of creativity, bringing joy to people, making sense of the world around us, whether it's through comedy or other forms. And, I can't imagine what it would be like to have that, as part of your identity. It must be pretty powerful.
It's definitely a part of my DNA. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Bill. And I try to conduct my life in the same way. Phil was a man who was able to balance confidence with humility, and that confidence never became arrogance. And he was so well loved by everybody who knew him, because he never pulled that star thing with anybody. He never had an attitude. And it blows people's minds when I tell them stories about how when he left SNL and he and I worked on a project that didn't end up happening for about a year, and he ended up on news radio. I vividly remember being in my mid-20s one day trying to talk him off the ledge about him telling me how he didn't feel like he was pulling his weight amongst those cast members. And the one thing that I think everybody who knows who Phil Hartman is knows, he was the glue. That's what they called him at SNL. He was the one that pulled everything together. But what kept him humble is that success came very late to him. He was in the Groundlings for many years, and a lot of his colleagues were zooming past him, including his best friend in the world, John Lovitz, who made it to Saturday Night Live before he did. And Lovitz at one point was in Lorne Michaels' office begging him, saying, "You've got to hire this guy. He's funnier than I am." But Lorne's attitude was, well, if he's so funny, why is he such a dinosaur at an improv group in Los Angeles called the Groundlings? So when he finally did get it, he pretty much given up on the acting track. He was pursuing writing more. But I also think that kept him humble, that kept him hungry. He knew there were no guarantees. He felt like he had to work harder than everybody else. And I think that instilled in me that same attitude, that dirt dog thing, where you might have more talent than I do. And believe me, nobody had more talent than Phil Hartman. He didn't think so. I know so. But you're never going to outwork me. And I never saw him get outworked either.
I appreciate that as well. I'm 35 and, battling it out in New York. And I'd had a few moments where cool things happened or whatever, but I never felt like I got to where I wanted to be. And I still am nowhere near that. But it does motivate, being, in a position where it's like, hey, I really have to be Kevin Youkilis here. You know what I mean? I have to dig in and be that type of performer and put the work in more than anyone else in order to stay relevant or become, in anyone else's opinion relevant, I guess. And it is a different take, and it produces a very specific type of talent that I think it comes with humility, that if you are a protege and you're 18 and boom, you've made it to, you're playing Bonnaroo as a musician, or you're on SNL, or you're hosting on, you're an anchor on 1010 Wins in New York, whatever it is. I don't know what that what that feels like, obviously, but I mean, it must feel a lot different than that grinded out approach that yields a more maybe experienced take. And, you can hear that in like your show, like how to handle moments whenever I'm on Cat Country. You know how to handle the moment, you know how to segue, you know how to deal with a serious situation, you know how to make light of something, you know how to have fun with callers, you know how to, segue into a song, whatever it is. Those are things that come from life experience. And there's no way to replicate that if you're some kind of, child superstar.
That is most definitely true. And it's interesting because it becomes a shorthand if you do anything long enough. But just when you think you've seen it all, something comes along to slap you across the face and let you know you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, Look at the world we're living today.
Boom.
I never could have anticipated this in 1,000 years. But you also learn, too, to take a deep breath and go with the flow. And with 15 years on you, one of the ironies is when you're talking about, I'm working and I haven't gotten to the place where I want to be. If you're doing it right, you never find that place. And that's a lesson that I also learned from Phil Hartman, which was, he would say to me, I know you look at me and you think that I have it all. At the time he was at SNL and I would spend time with him there. And he said, but once you get here, it's never what you expected. And he used to say to my brother Kevin and myself, because we were a writing team at the time and working together, he said, I worry about you guys because you guys are like me. You want the work to stand on its own. You're not cutthroat. You're not brown nosers. You're not backstabbers. Well, guess what? You're going to be surrounded by those people who are continually going to try and undercut every single thing that you do. And sometimes they are going to succeed, and it can be soul crushing. And they take what should be this awesome thing and somehow find a way to destroy it. And everywhere where I've been, when I've said, if I just do this, I'll be happy. If I just make this much money, if I find such and such a person to be in a relationship with, look, relationships like anything else take work. Just ask my wife. She's right off camera here and probably give her, hi, honey, love you.
I know the feeling. Yeah.
He told me a story. This is one of my favorite stories, and publicly the name has been released before, but I will keep it private to a degree to give you an example of the frustration. When you are on a writing team, and Phil and all of the cast members write and submit sketches with writers on their own, and you bring it early in the week to a table read, which is essentially the entire cast is there, the host that week, the producers, really everybody. They've got scripts in front of them, and you're reading it as if you were going to be performing it on the show. And how something does at the table is step number one in terms of whether or not it will get on. But even if it kills, somebody could walk into Lauren's office afterward and say, did you really think that was funny? And start tearing it apart and eventually pushing it off the air. There was a fellow cast member on Saturday Night Live who did that constantly. He was rather diminutive in stature, and he just kept screwing Phil left and right and left and right. And he said, and one day, and Phil was a West Coast hippie, and very rarely did I see him lose his temper or say anything bad about anybody. But he said, I'm walking down the hall, and here he comes, and he says, hey, Phil, and I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed him by the shirt, and I pinned him up against the wall. And suddenly the headline flashed in my head, 200-pound comedian kills dwarf. He said, that was enough to make me just let him go, drop him, and watch him run away. Yeah. But he never bleeped with me again after that. And to hear stories like that, and believe me, that was one of many, for as great as everybody thinks that it is to finally get that job, it's just like any other job. There are politics, there are favorites, there are brown nosers. It's not unlike anything else. And I think that's what helps to keep me grounded, and what helped to keep him grounded was just like, look, make the best of whatever situation that you're in, and realize you could always be in a worse situation. I'm very grateful for what I do. Am I going to tell you that I go in there every day loving life and loving my job, and that it's not a grind, and there are certain days that I don't want to be there at all? But I always say to people coming up in the industry, the way that you earn your money are those days where you don't want to be there. I have been there while Phil Hartman was murdered. I've been there through a miscarriage, a divorce, deaths in the family. If you turn the radio on, you would have no idea. And that is how you earn your money. You can't bring that stuff with you. You have to put it aside. And that's the definition in this industry, especially. And even in the comedy writing industry, when you're not in the mood to write comedy, that's what being a pro is. You got to deliver the goods regardless.
I completely understand that. You know, you've really got to be able to tap into the zone no matter what the situation is in your personal life. And for artists of any stripe, you know, it's tough because you wear that on your sleeve, but you know, you've got an audience and you've got a job to do that requires, like any other technical job, if you're operating on a patient or installing a power line, you know, you have to be, whatever it is, you've got to be able to tap into the moment. Very difficult. You know, and it's, look, I mean, right now, even with the amount of anxiety and frankly, depression that's out there, and, you know, the frustration and so on and so forth, you know, it's more so than ever important for those who have a platform in, especially in my opinion, in radio or new talk media, as they're calling it, or, you know, television, whatever it is. I mean, you can't, if Gene Valacente's having a bad day, you know what I mean? You can't, he's not going to smash his iPad on the 6 o'clock news. You know what I mean?
That'd be great if he did though, huh?
It might be well worth it for the ratings. They'd pull ahead 100% at that point. You know what I mean? But when did you realize in your life, because it's always fascinating, if I feel like there's usually some moment in your early childhood, if you're an artist of any stripe, where you're like, okay, I've got to do this. Usually everybody tells you you can't do that. You've got to go find some kind of stable job. And then your life evolves in such a way that it's impossible eventually to turn in another direction without being, kind of squashing yourself and your self-actualization. When was that for you?
It's as if you've been Zooming my entire life, my friend. And it's interesting because for the longest time, and I know you're a musical guy, as am I, and I think anybody who gets into radio on the music side, that's how it starts.
Yeah.
And in my mind, at some point in high school, as I learned the guitar and wanted to become the next Edward Van Halen and was gigging around and kept working just as hard at that as I do what I do now, and realized at some point that I hit a plateau and I was never going to be that guy, I thought, well, now what am I going to do? And it got to the point where I graduated high school. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I hated school and I didn't want to go to college. So my parents forced me to go. I went to Rick. I was undecided for 2 years. I was going through some relationship stuff, was really struggling from a grades perspective. And I happened to be working in a sandwich shop. And at that time, I was about 16 years old. And are you old enough to remember Art Lake from Channel 10, sir?
I wrote to Art Lake and Frank Coletta in, I guess, 1992. And I watched them every single day. I can remember when Salty Brian was on the show and Tony DiBiasio as well, on that Sunrise show. That's formative television for me. They wrote me back a letter. Good luck with your career choice, Billy. It's a grind. Also,
and I had a similar thing with John Giorsi too, who corresponded with me from a very young age, and I really do value that. And when I'm put in that position now, I always try to pay it back and make sure that I acknowledge anybody else who takes that time. But Art Lake, the reason why I bring him up is one of the guys that I worked with was very good friends with Andy Lake, who was Art's son, and the three of us were rabid David Letterman fans. And I'm talking Letterman back in the NBC days, Late Night with David Letterman, where I would get up every day and my whole day just focused around watching that show at 12:30. To me, it's still the greatest television show of all time. And one day, Andy just turned to me and he said, you know what would be a really cool job? He said, writing for David Letterman. And it was as if I was hit by a lightning bolt. And I said, I think that would be the best job ever. Because I didn't want to be Letterman. As I said, I wanted to remain relatively anonymous, but I wanted to be a part of that creative process. So that was the moment that everything changed. And I got into the mass communications program. My grades took off like a rocket. And I've never looked back, in spite of exactly what you said. Everyone telling me that I was out of my mind, including my parents, who, and this is a secret for the kids out there, in terms of not having student loans. When you tell your parents that you don't want to go to school, they say, look, we'll pay for it. So they were spending money on this major that they thought was going to be a complete and total waste of time. And I remember getting warned that I was going to end up homeless, that I'd better marry rich, I'd better have a backup plan. But that might be the best thing that my parents ever did, because that instilled in me, oh yeah, well, I'll show you. And I've never stopped, with having that foot on that gas pedal all the way to the floor, because I always felt like I had to prove it not only to people who doubted me, but also to myself. And eventually my parents, years later, were like, we were wrong.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's
hopefully they got enough out of that investment.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they did. It's interesting. You mentioned the musician thing, and look, I've sort of evolved my musical goals now, where I'm still, and obviously everything's changed with the nature of the beast here, where no one can perform or tour or anything like that. I still play out and have a band, and I have a record that I'm working on, a solo record, etc. But I've taken the approach of, you know what, let's not worry about becoming the next superstar. I'd rather make something that makes me feel like, all right, great, this is what I have to express. And the idea of turning into a career or whatever is sort of secondary now. And I can genuinely say that because I have really tapped into what I think was always there for me as my primary passion, which is broadcasting. And I see a much more, I guess, more opportunity there at this point. But it's fascinating because you mentioned, your experience. Jim Taricani had a similar experience where he was a musician and so on and so forth. And somehow broadcasting is a natural extension of music. And what you do as a musician, if you're writing songs, performing, etc., reaching people, communicating to people, I believe it's just a slight variation to go into broadcasting. You know what I mean? And it's cool that, it makes sense that you'd come from that perspective and your cadence and understanding the moment. It's very similar. I don't know if you find that.
I find that it's all born out of the same place. You're just using different creative muscles, but it's all creativity. And from time to time, I'll still pick up the guitar. I'll write a song. I still have this little crappy 8-track thing here, and
nice.
I really enjoy it. But like I said, I got to this point where I thought, well, I'm never going to be as good as Eddie Van Halen. And to me, like, that was the mountaintop. But I looked around and I said, boy, there are a lot of crappy radio and TV shows. And maybe I won't get to the top of the mountain, but I feel like even though I might not be LeBron James on the Lakers, I could be one of his teammates and hold my own enough that I could make a decent living off of it. And that in some ways has been good enough. And to speak to what you're talking about in terms of what motivates and what drives you, and like I said, not looking so much at numbers and trying to ignore some of the white noise that you see on social media, it's a form of therapy. And for that same guy, myself, who would go into work after my friend and mentor had been murdered, or I'd gone through that divorce or lost a baby and all of those other things, it turns into this thing where you start to ask yourself, well, how can I channel that back into the creative process? And is there a way for me to make that relatable content, which is the bane of my wife's existence, because the brain never goes off. And she's trained so well now as we approach 14 years together, where something will happen and she's like knee jerk before she even says anything else. That's not for the air. That is not a radio break. That is not content. I'm like, son of a. But, and I think even with music, if you get in there and you're angry, and I find this too with comedy, I find that the best stuff comes out of me musically, comedically, anything, when I'm in the worst mood. And I think it takes you out of that bad mood. And that's how it serves as that therapy. And so I completely hear what you're saying in terms of, in some ways, I have to satisfy myself too before I worry about everybody else. But if you want to make a living at it, you got to find the balance too.
Exactly. I learned that as a fill-in on WPRO that, there's an audience that you've got to serve as well. And, you can go out there and start, I can bring people on talking about solar panels on brownfields or whatever. But the reality is maybe that audience is all set with that conversation. So you've got to make those adjustments to what you're doing. And your sense of humor in certain areas, it's got to be adjusted, but also be authentic based on the audience that you're serving. I'm sure that, the same is true on Cat Country. Of course, Cat Country has a really broad audience. You know what I mean? I think that's one of the special things about that station. Number one, that it's independently owned and operated. That's a highly unusual thing in this day and age. But then also number two, your studio is like walking into a spaceship. It's a beautiful studio. It might be the best. I've been lucky enough to be in there. I did one voiceover job like 4 years ago at Cat Country, and it was like, wow, that was a moment for me where I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to get up in the morning and come to a building like this and be here, be creative, work, etc. Just from walking into that facility. But when you're serving a broad audience, the way that Cat Country does, you just have to trust your personality and trust that people are tuning in because they want to hear what you have to say, and they're looking for the humor, or they're looking for the information, and it's not just based on the brand recognition. People have choices now. people can easily listen to the music that is on Cat Country on YouTube or Spotify or whatever, but they can't get the moments that come unpredictably, every single day on a radio station from any other medium at this point. So you have to really trust yourself, I guess, that you're serving.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that evolves over time too. And one of the things that I've learned, not only in doing it, but in listening to other people, is that the audience is a lot smarter than most people give them credit for. And they can smell phony from a mile away. They know artifice. There are times I'll be listening to sports radio where there's a guy who'll be on there who I know is just saying things just to get a reaction, and I'm yelling at the radio, and my wife's like, "Why are you even listening to this?"
Yeah.
Because I just feel like that's such a violation of the audience's trust just to make the phones ring. And I'm not a fan of that kind of radio. The other lesson that I had to learn, and especially since I got my start with Carolyn Fox, another name from the past here in broadcasting at HJY. And I started as a rock guy, and I was a rock guy for quite some time. The content for a rock audience is vastly different than the content that you deliver to that family who is listening to country music. And there were some bumps in the road trying to find that middle ground. And there was one station in between the two I was at for 5 years, which was Coast.
Oh, yeah.
And very female friendly. And I think I made most of my mistakes there in terms of that transition. And not to say that I don't continue to make mistakes, because believe me, I do. But I was just having this conversation with Maddie, my co-host, for a podcast that we do today. And I was talking to our 20-year-old last night, and we were having a conversation about comedy. And I said, with everything, when it comes to content, there is a line. And throughout my career, I don't know if you can hear my cat wailing. I apologize for that.
Authenticity.
Exactly. The line is constantly moving, and you need to know and recognize where the line is and how close you can get to it without stepping over it and jeopardizing your career. But as I said, that's something that changes on a daily basis, and trying to figure out what people want to hear has changed too, even within the last 5 years. And we came to a decision about 3 years ago. We would be very topical and we would be political at times. And it just got to a point where it was becoming so polarizing. And even if I wasn't coming right out and saying how I felt about a certain something, people began taking leaps and making assumptions that it wasn't worth it. And I said, I'm a big fan of Steve Martin. And I've read his autobiography, and one of the most fascinating things about it was he was talking about how he came up, and people always thought that, oh my God, he was a comedian. He was selling out Madison Square Garden, and what an overnight success he was. And he's like, the hell I was. That was years and years and years of trying to figure out what I needed to do. And what I did at the time was I took a look around, and I saw Vietnam, and I saw Nixon, and I saw all of these political comedians, and I saw all the anger and everyone getting all worked up. And I thought, what's the way to stand out here? How about I play a banjo and put an arrow through my head and just be goofy and silly and make people forget about all of that? That's where I think the line is now, not only politically, but also in the era of a pandemic. I think that people really, and if you look at ratings, because I do peek at them from time to time, normally news talk stations would get an enormous boost from something like this. And that's not to say, and that's not an insult to them at all. You know, they're doing just fine and they're delivering in ways. And I'm friends with everybody from every station. I've been around long enough, and somebody like a Matt Allen, I could not possibly have more respect for his ability and everything else. But I do think at times now, people are looking for that arrow through the head. You know, they just don't want to be hit over the head with COVID-19 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, especially when we're all at home and families are at each other's throats. And when are we going to be able to get out and everything else? I really do think this is an era where if you want to succeed, provide some form of escapism.
That is so fascinating. I'm going to take that to heart myself, no doubt about it.
But that's not to say that the pandemic doesn't have its time and place. Look, everybody is talking about it, and we do as well, but maybe there's kind of a goofy way to talk about it as opposed to a really and truly heavy way, in terms of how you're entertaining yourself throughout this whole thing, or how your spouse is getting on your nerves, or, what's the first thing that you're going to do when this is all over. Everything that we do in life, Bill, someone told me this at a very young age. It's all about distracting ourselves from our ultimate fate. You know what I mean? You put on a sports game, you get in the car, you've got the radio on, you're listening to a podcast, you get home, you're reading a book, you're doing everything but dealing with reality. Yeah. Because if you just sat there 24 hours a day and dealt with reality all the time, we'd all be in insane asylums. Yeah. So it's our duty as broadcasters, and incidentally, we are not frontline workers in any respect of the word. And while I'm very glad to have a job right now, I have more appreciation than ever for people who are saving lives, putting theirs on the line, and keeping us safe. How I view my job, and I always say this is a really fun but dumb way to make a living, is to give those people a moment to just be like, oh, I'm going to forget about what I just went through and listen to this idiot say something stupid.
What a beautiful way to put that. Radio in general, I feel like there's two schools of thought. There's some people say, oh, radio's over, no one listens anymore. And then there are people who are like, actually the factual people who realize that radio is as integral a portion of someone's media diet as anything. Do you get the sense that most of your listeners are still on the terrestrial side, or are people, getting on the Cat Country app or whatever, the website, whatever it is, and finding you that way, or listening after the fact? Obviously, you have your own podcast with Maddie, but do you feel like the radio magic? Because I'm someone who loves the crackle of listening to the Fan, which is one of my favorite radio stations, WFAN out of New York. I could easily listen to that on an app and have Mike Francesa or Joe and Evan crystal clear, but all day I'll listen to it on the AM just for that magic, knowing that there's this transmission happening in real time. Do you think that's still in the public consciousness, or is it shifting to the point where the format is ready to turn to primarily a digital format?
I think this is another example of where the line is constantly moving, and there is an old school element for yours truly where I love that intimacy of radio and the theater of the mind and that connection that you forge with the listener. Am I silly enough to say that my 20-year-old has the same relationship with it? Absolutely not. So how and where is that line moving? And as I said to you a little while ago, when I first started, 4 hours a day, I did my show. I heard how much they loved me or they hated me. I went home, and then I started working on tomorrow's show. It's not that simple anymore. Now it's, okay, I'm done with this morning's effort. Now it's time for me to hop on social media and try to put up maybe an engaging or a relatable post. Now it's time for me to take a few minutes to answer as many emails and DMs that I'm getting to stay engaged with my listener base and my way of saying thank you to them. Okay, Maddie, now it's time for us to shoot a video or do a Facebook Live. Oh, don't forget, we've got the podcast to do. Oh, we've got an interview scheduled. It's a lot more busy work than it used to be. But if you want to remain viable in this world, you've got to be willing to make those adjustments. And I think one of the saddest things for me as a fan of broadcasting was watching my hero, David Letterman, age so much right in front of my eyes, where he was just going in to do the show because it was something to do, and he couldn't be bothered with rehearsal, the pre-tapes, the man on the street stuff he used to do. He didn't want to hear anything about YouTube or any of that stuff. And then he started getting political and made it less and less about the comedy, which a lot of late night TV is going down that road. I'm not a fan of that personally. That's another area in which maybe I'm a little bit old school. I want to laugh. I don't want sanctimony, but
Right.
that's one man's opinion, and part of what I'm saying about how we're doing the banjo and the arrow through the head at this point. But you'll become a dinosaur really quickly if you don't try to keep up with everybody else. So I don't think it's just about the transmitter anymore. As a matter of fact, give it 5 years, we're all going to be hanging laundry on those transmitters, and a lot of it's going to move to the internet. But just because it moves doesn't mean that the bare bone foundational elements aren't still going to be in place. I still need to come up with relatable content that people care about. I still need to know where the line is in terms of offending my audience, a sponsor, a member of management, all of those things. A lot of people feel like you just turn the microphone on and you talk.
Yeah.
I was also saying this to the boy last night. I said, if you had any idea how many things I want to say, I just kind of have to go up to the back of my head and say, I'll entertain myself with that one because I want to still be able to put the alarm code in and be able to get in.
Yeah.
It's a silly, fun job, but until you try to show somebody how to do it sometimes, you're like, wow, there's a lot more involved in this than I really thought, because some of it does become second nature.
Last couple of minutes here, your take right now as we, I guess we're going to be in this moment, it seems, in terms of the lockdown or however you want to put it. We're going to be here for a little bit longer than probably anyone anticipated, except for maybe some highly in the know officials when it all began. Do you sense that there's going to be a burnout point where people are going to start to turn off media, or are we in the media, especially on that sort of entertainment, news talk, music, comedy, etc. side, news talk as in, I guess, the opinion side of it more so than the straight news? Do you think that is going to be sought more and more as we move along, and people will start to drift away from the press conferences? And that, where do you see people's attention going as we move along here, especially with the summer coming up?
Well, as a consumer, I will tell you, and she and I went to middle school together. I tune in the Governor every single day, and I watch that. And even though I have a history with her, I feel like I'm relating to her a little bit more, and that my relationship with her as a viewer is becoming somewhat more intimate, and it's changing my opinion of her in certain ways. And I hesitate to use the word opportunity, but I think for people who work in the media, this is an opportunity to maybe take that relationship to everybody who takes the time to spend a little bit of their morning or afternoon with you, and make it that much more intimate and establish more of a relationship. Because at a time of crisis, when people are really paying attention, you better be bringing your A game. And if you can prove to them that you are worthy of their time when everything is going to crap, when things start to lighten up, you've become that familiar voice that now entertains them. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I actually think that it's going to help most of us who do what we do, as long as we're doing it right and we're serving them in the ways that we should.
Fascinating stuff there. All right. What's the best way? Obviously, tune in to 98.1 in the morning. That's one way. But what's the best way for people to find your content and kind of get it digitally or in any other way?
We've got all kinds of social media platforms. I mean, I have personal pages. You can find the Brian Mulhern page on Facebook. There's also a personality page, but people seem to like the personal one. And I'm pretty open to allowing just about everybody onto that, as long as you behave yourself. At Brian Cat Country on Twitter, at Cat Country Mornings on most of those places, Instagram, everything else. 98.1, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., Monday through Friday with Maddie. I'm on Saturday morning, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. as all of this is going on as well. And I want to close by turning the tables a little bit, bringing Phil Hartman back into the conversation, and saying something about you, my friend, which is this. One of the conversations that I had with Phil Hartman that stuck with me to this day was I was in kind of a bad place and doubting myself. And he said, one night I was at the Groundlings and it was kind of empty and I felt like I was about to have a real crap show. And I looked up and there was the legendary actor Jack Lemmon. And I thought, holy crap. So he said, I better work as hard as possible to put on the best show possible for that legend. So he gets through, feels like he has a decent night. There's a knock on the dressing room door. He opens it up and it's Jack Lemmon. And Jack Lemmon says to him, look, I know you're not all that young. He said, but what I just saw out there was pretty incredible. And you are a really talented guy. And for whatever it's worth, when you feel like maybe you aren't and you feel like none of this is worth it, I want you to remember this conversation, but there's something else that I want you to do for me too. When you find yourself in a position that you see somebody else who you think is talented, let them know and pay that forward. And I'm not blowing smoke here, man. I am really impressed with what you have done and how you have done it. And I am a fan. And I mean, we got introduced through a mutual friend in the form of Ben DeCastro. And I really started paying attention to what you're doing, man. And I really think you're killing it in a number of different directions. So for whatever it's worth, from Jack Lemmon to Phil Hartman, from Brian Mulhern to Bill Bartholomew, tip of the cap, sir, and make sure you pay that forward to somebody else down the line.
That means the world, man. I really appreciate that, Brian. Honestly, I really do.
And I truly mean it, man. Really, you're killing it. Keep it up.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it a lot.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this. It literally has been for months. I mean,
it is.
I'm glad we finally did.
No, I'm glad we just did the Zoom. And let's do an in-person. Let's do more down the line. I'd love to have both you and Maddie on, or even get social media influencer Ben DeCastro involved, do like a panel. I think there's a lot of things we can do that, even as wacky as it might be, I've always been like, what would happen if we had like multiple personalities from different outlets on the same podcast? What would that look like? Would management get involved and go, hold on a second, no, we can't do that? But you know what I mean? Be interesting.
I only have one request. Even if the pandemic passes and everybody's safe, if we're doing something with DeCastro, I still want him to wear the face mask.
Absolutely. Gloves, face shield. Face shield, please. Full gown.
Definitely.
Well, thanks so much.
Man. This was
Absolutely.
a blast.
This was great. This was like really brought my spirits up a lot as well. So I'm so glad we did this.
Glad I could help, and right back at you.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hey, discover over 200 episodes of the Bartholomew Town Podcast wherever you get your pods or at ripodcast.com.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.